their priorities a little bit more. I can see what their thinking is. They can see what mine is. I can talk to an engineer what how they're going to go about building something, or how they're thinking about going about building something. And whether or not the company is kind of set up to allow that kind of like mingling of information, or
right.
The worst side of it is when it's sort of like maybe unintentionally siloed these groups out. So it's like it's going to be like a really big hassle to overcome those hurdles, those walls.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Maybe that's just something to look at, because a company can inadvertently make it really, really hard to have that kind of like that sharing, that ubiquitous knowledge sharing. I'd agree with that. Sure.
Right, because I can see, especially somebody who's maybe not a super experienced user experience person, solving for the product manager and not for the user.
Mm-hmm.
And even though they're a representative of that person, that's not really the right person, right? I mean...
Most definitely. I mean, and that's why there has to be that healthy challenge, and that's why more folks that have eyes on the customer is the better. I mean, I was like pragmatic marketing, where you're only an opinion of one, right? So I mean, we all think that we know what we're talking about, and we've talked to 100 customers, or we've seen all the different data that we've collected on things. But at the same time, there's also different people will interpret that data in different ways, right? And interpret when they're talking to the customer in different ways. In fact, when you're doing that, when you're doing good UX research or good research from a product side, going out market research, you should have more than one person, because it's oftentimes one person has that same view, and the question is, if two people are sitting in that same meeting or talking to that same customer and they have different views, and it's like and if you notice that a lot when you're a product manager, then you start asking yourself, why is that? So.
Yeah. No, that's kind of a great point. Maybe it's just to put it back in a question for maybe the two of you guys. Yeah. I mean, because as a designer myself, like a lot of times it's like, especially as a lead designer, like with a team, we let's say we've done our research, we've talked to who we're going to talk to, and we've analyzed that data, and we've come down to some kind of core meaning behind it. This is how we're going to build what we're going to build. Here's what it means to the audience. For you two as PMs, product managers, do you feel that you get enough insight, and do you also get the chance to understand what that stuff means? So like when you're in those meetings, do you know what I mean? So like when I go forward to like pitch, like here's what we're going to do for the design on this thing, here's how it's going to impact, here's how it's going to meet these use cases. Does it make sense how I got there, so you guys could also defend that, or do you usually just bring the UX person back into the room at that point?
For me, it's I definitely want to know how the sausage is being made, because I feel that if I have a better understanding of how that person is working through the problem, it allows me to anticipate what bigger or lesser challenges are going to be like in the future. That way I can plan better. That way I can set better expectations. At least I would say that from a project management standpoint, to get an idea of this level of, when we talk about story points, like this was a 4-point story, this was a 20-point story, even though there should never be a 20-point story, but still, you get what I'm saying. How about you, Dave?
I agree. That tends to be my personality, but I also, realistic thing when the product management role is a role that, it can be really frustrating, because it's something that people are asking. You have so many competing priorities, right? So this is the challenge, I think, for a lot of product managers here in town, is that they're just being asked to do so much, and some things just have to sort of fall by the wayside. And so it's a matter of, based on a given week at a given time of year, what that's going to be. So the answer probably is going to depend a lot on, that time of year, what your situation is in that organization, what makes sense, how detailed you're going to get. But I agree. Ideally, you have the bandwidth to be able to do just what you're saying.
What I think is a common trap for product managers is that they're relying on their personal opinion about design. They're not necessarily just judging it from the customer standpoint, that they're allowing a personal bias to jump in the way there. I think that's, again, I've seen it over and over again where somebody, it's like I'm reminding people, you're not the user. You're the product manager, you might even be the product owner, but you're not, and you might actually use the product, but you're not the user, right? Yes. How are you going to be able to have those conversations, Jason, when you're handing those designs off? These designs should really be looked at more as a hypothesis than a like a roadmap, right? Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
do you get where I'm going with that?
Yeah, I think so. I think it depends a little bit on what the work is, right? And as we were just kind of talking through it, I was in the back of my head thinking like, man, we should maybe hit on like the difference between like a product that is like live and in flight versus like maybe like a brand new build for something that's super short lived,
Sure,
or it's gonna just for what its nature is gonna be to some degree quite static. But yeah, no, so especially something that's gonna. We did as much as we could right up front in the design process, in the UX process. It's like 100% of the time never enough to like actually understand something fully, right? You just there's constraints around it.
Yeah.
There's the time we could put into it. It's the money we could spend on it. It's the people we could get a hold of. So yeah, we design to the best that we can within those constraints. And then we put it forward. Yeah. And it is a hypothesis. It's like, from what we knew, here's what it is. The next step is to test on this. Did we meet it across success metrics for the product itself? Can we start looking at analytic data as it starts flowing in? Is it doing the things that we thought it would? I mean, so there's questions that you want answers to, and then you start to see the other stuff that kind of says, oh, there's something we didn't even know was going on over here, that sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
But let's talk for a second to people that are interested in getting into product management. I want to talk to, maybe it's a user experience person or a project manager or somebody who's maybe interested in moving over into product management. Let's say, Jason, from your perspective, if it is somebody in the user experience space that wants to move necessarily from, the design space, but they want to take that skill set and move more into that product management, product owner role, what would be some of the advice that you would share with that person on what they should be learning, and maybe even more importantly, what should they unlearn?
Sure. That's a tricky question. I think the biggest one for me, if it were like somebody from my team, like looking to move in that direction, it would be getting a lot of like project lead experience, right? There's a lot of upfront stuff that happens in early conversations that I think you would just need to be exposed to, that maybe a more junior designer just isn't aware of, as far as these are the constraints that I'm kind of like dealing with. So I think with kind of like with that said, like saying, hey, like you're really going to need to step up. It is a lot of proactive actions, lots of like asking the product manager what's going on with this, making sure that they understand, kind of like what I was talking about really early on.
Okay.
With those early sort of what appear might be like conflicting priorities, getting to know what those are. Yeah, so I think that's kind of the biggest one for me, is just getting in there and seeing it, because there is a lot of shared like care and responsibility for the app, right, or whatever we're making, whatever product. But just having an understanding of like what makes this thing successful and how it incorporates into the business is really, really kind of like the early key for me, I guess, from the design side.
And so, from your perspective, Dave, if you were talking to somebody that is on the user experience side, or a project manager or things like that were interested in moving into a product management role, what would be some of the suggestions you'd have?
Yeah, so every time I talk with folks on this, and you get this question a lot, and I think the first thing I do ask people is why do you want to do this? Like, I think people oftentimes look at product management in a certain role and as a certain vision of this, some product managers look at their role as a lot more important than it is. I mean, these roles, I always say it's a team that's coming together, right? And you each are serving a different place in that team. So first of all, it's trying to understand their motivations, whether they're a BA, whether they're a developer, whether a user experience person, and really trying to understand their motivations before talking with them more on what it means to be a product manager, how to get there. But I first try to understand that motivation. And I think that's, one thing to do is, first of all, I advise folks, talk to a couple other product managers in your organization, understand what the role is in that organization, because I think there's also a perception of what that role is that oftentimes is not the same what reality is, right? So that's the first thing I do ask folks. Now, obviously, then when they're really set on, it's like, what kind of skills do I need? How do I, make that jump? Things like that. First of all, I always say as a product manager, you have a little less, you have to be a little more macro, a little less micro, but you have to be able to play in both. And so because of that, you have to sort of have more comfort in letting go of things and trusting others in those different capacities, whether it's a user experience person, whether it's, somebody on the analytics team, whatever it is. And then, to sort of make that transition, it's, is there opportunities to sort of job share in that role? Can you get sort of that 20% time? It's going to be organization, but, make that ask. If you're really serious about wanting to explore it, there's no better way to do than, put your toes in to test it out a little bit, but then not sort of overly commit yourself so that, you feel awkward going back and you feel guilty going back.
Yep. I like the first part of that answer. I'm not sure if you knew that, but it was a very UX-y answer. Understand the motivations of what's driving this person to try to do this. I like
my past life.
There
right?
you go. Yeah,
it's good. That's good. Yeah, because I mean, I've seen where people have gone to battle a senior UI developer and a product owner, and honestly, it's in the case that I'm thinking of. When you got down to it, they just didn't want to lose ground in the organization. Like it had nothing to do with who was right or who was wrong. It was about who held some decision-making power within the organization. And I think kind of where you were saying earlier, Jason, I think some organizations inadvertently set themselves up in a way where they're putting people into those positions where they feel like that.
Yeah. I think sometimes it's interesting, like, kind of talking about, the motivations that drive somebody into a role like product manager. I think sometimes it seems like that's like the role that's in charge of the whole thing, right? And so it's almost like it looks like a prestige thing from some angle, and that's how some organizations can present it. Like this person is in charge of basically the ship, and I mean, they get to see all the pieces in play for sure. How do you guys kind of like that to work? Because I feel like I can see a path for a power dynamic like that to be in play, where that is literally the boss of the team or the manager of the teams that will be working on it. Also, I see a completely legitimate path where that role is like a peer amongst the engineering leads and the design leads. It's like another facet of the team, right?
Yeah.
They're in charge of different widgets at that point.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what you were saying. I think it depends on the product itself, but I would encourage mostly that if it really comes down to an integrated team, in my opinion, these days, because, and I'm assuming my focus on this topic is around technology, but I'm assuming we're talking about technology products, and because technology moves at the speed of yesterday. I don't think we have time for silos and handoffs in today's world anymore for those types, to leave it open for those types of arguments to happen. How about you, Dave?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think there's also the question of the dynamic, and we haven't got into it, but there's the product owner versus a product manager versus a product marketer versus technical product manager, and there's all these different delineations, and you're seeing more of that because I don't know, I mean, I'm sure you both are familiar with pragmatic marketing, and I think they just do a good job. I mean, I think there's some gaps that could be done, but in general they do a good job laying out from strategy to execution what's all the sort of the components related to rolling out a product, that whole life cycle, and the portfolio of products. And I think when you look at that, you just see a tremendous amount. There isn't one person doing all those things. And even as a product manager, to really do any of these things well, it takes usually a team of people. So you do have the question of a product owner being more of embedded. They're with the team a lot. You're seeing that happen more often. And then you'll have, whether you want to call it a product manager or a strategic product manager or whatever you want to call it, that's maybe a little more delineated from things. So this is that is the challenge, is as especially the bigger the organization, especially when you talk to like B2B products versus the B2C products. B2B products have that all a lot of stuff on the sales cycle and all that kind of stuff. So how do you work on that end of things, servicing the buyer and all those components too. So that's where these are so situationally dependent how we're talking about, but yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, and sometimes, finding a common enemy to fight against is good, like sales, right?
Everyone can fight about sales.
I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah.
I'm joking about the common enemy, but at the same time, I think the roles are distinctly different, but they do have these overlapping pieces. And I think if people are having those deliberate conversations about where I end, where you begin, what your responsibilities are, versus what my responsibilities are, is important, because I think sometimes people focus more on